While you're all introducing yourselves, and I'm going to take a moment to introduce our fantastic lineup of speakers. So speaker number one, Mike Evans, who's the Senior Manager of Government Relations with the Fort McKay First Nation. Mike's worked with Indigenous communities and provincial municipal governments on a wide variety of land use plans since the mid-90s. And he was instrumental in the final stages and completion of the Moose Lake Access Management Plan, which we're going to be hearing all about shortly. We also have with us Ryan Grandjambe, otherwise known as Onion, who's the Guardian Lead for the Fort McKay First Nation. Ryan is a member of the Fort McKay First Nation and a proud father of 4. He's currently a guardian for the nation, responsible for environmental, thermal, and air monitoring, amongst other things. He's a lifelong trapper and a junior partner on a trap line within the traditional territory of Fort McKay. He was also employed in the mining industry for 15 years. We also have with us Lorne Gould, who's a consultant with the Fort McKay First Nation. Lorne works in multiple capacities with Fort McKay First Nation and is helping to implement the Moose Lake Management Plan. He's a professional biologist and owner of Gould Environmental, and his background is in wildlife biology and environmental assessment. And he's got tons of experience with camera traps, caribou surveys, community-based monitoring, as well as environmental guardians. So without further ado, I would invite Mike to please turn on your camera if you can, Mike, and your mic, and welcome you to the presentation, to the webinar. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Amanda. Good morning, good afternoon, folks, depending on where you are. On behalf of Ryan and Lorne, my colleagues, I'd like to welcome you, but also to thank you for this invitation to speak to you about our experience at Fort McKay with the intersection, I guess you would say, of caribou conservation with our efforts to protect a key landscape around the nation's Moose Lake reserves, which are slightly north of the Hamlet Reservation. The title of our program, sorry, Amanda, is there on the slide, consistent with the work of the circle. And very briefly, I'll go through then the program with you, for you, on the next slide. I'm going to speak with you initially about the Moose Lake Plan, which has sort of proved to be the impetus for this webinar. Lauren's going to talk with you about the Red Earth Caribou Range Restoration Planning Project. And then Ryan will speak to you about our Environmental Guardian program, which predated the adoption of the Moose Lake Plan, but was a big supporting component to helping us to create our argument for the government to put enhanced protection on those lands. And then we'll have some questions and discussion. Next slide, please. So first of all, we thought it was useful for you to have an appreciation of what it was that Fort McKay was facing, located here right in the middle of the oil sands. You can see from these 3 maps, the first of which at the upper right is a satellite map of what was happening in the Fort McKay area in 1967. The only oil sands project, and it was really still just a research and development project at the time, was being done by Sun Oil out of the US, which eventually became Suncor. And the actual area of the project, you probably wouldn't even be able to see. It is represented by that bright green spot there. But that bright green spot actually is the 2020 footprint of the project. So it would have been almost indistinguishable from low orbit next to the reserves on this map. By 2020, however, the landscape had changed considerably, and you can see again in that one red circle that's the lower of the 2, which is where the Fort McKay reserves are located, that the community is surrounded on 3 sides by oil sands mines, oil sands development, and there are increasing in the darker green color SAG-D projects or in situ projects. Those are projects that don't disturb the surface, but there's lots of activity underground for bitumen extraction. The orange lines represent any number of different linear disturbances, whether those be roads or seismic lines or forestry access roads, what have you. And then the third map on the lower right also indicates areas which the provincial government has, for which the provincial government has issued oil sands leases for potential development. And so you can see that looking at that map, the Fort McKay traditional territory, which is indicated by the white outline in maps 1 and 2. If you look at the third map, well over 70% of Fort McKay's traditional territory has been leased out for potential oil sands development, and only those areas which are either existing provincial or federal parks have no development within them. So there was a lot of concern that developed beginning in the early 2000s in Fort McKay over the encroachment of oil sands development on the Moose Lake reserves, which is indicated by the second round circle to the northwest of the hamlet, which were and still are in a relatively undisturbed area, certainly when compared with Fort McKay proper. Those also were the community's first reserves that were issued in 1915. And so there was a growing movement in the community to try to protect not only the reserves, but the landscape around the reserves for the exercise of treaty rights and practicing traditional land uses. Next slide, please. So as I say, the Moose Lake reserves are northwest of the hamlet of Fort McKay, roughly 65 kilometers, indicated again on the map there. Those have been recognized for close to 100 years. Treaty 8 was initially signed in 1899 as a landscape in which traditional uses could be carried on without interruption. And as I said earlier, with the encroachment of development, protecting that area became more and more important to the community. Next slide, please. So when SAG-D developments began to get closer and closer to Moose Lake, Chief Boucher began to argue with the Alberta Energy Regulator that there should be some sort of protective setback from the Moose Lake reserves to protect those lands. There were a number of attempts that failed beginning in 2003. Then again in 2015, in the second of those attempts, Alberta proposed for the first time a special management zone that was 10 kilometers, extended 10 kilometers outward from the Fort McKay reserves, which you can see then in this map is indicated by that red line around the reserves. And that became the basis for subsequent conversations about what could be done in this area. The 10-kilometer zone, what we call the 10 KMZ, includes the Birch Mountains Wildland Provincial Park, which is indicated by the green area. The reserves are in pink. And then you've got that hashed area in sort of the dun color with the green diagonal lines is known as the mixed use zone. That happens, the 10-kilometer zone happens to overlap with the Red Earth Caribou Range, which is why it becomes relevant for today's conversation. And the question as we were trying to have the Moose Lake Plan adopted by the provincial government was how to manage development inside the mixed use zone so that treaty rights can still be meaningfully exercised. So how do we resolve the conflict between industrial development and treaty rights? Next slide, please. Inside the 10-kilometer zone, it's important to understand, and this goes back to the slide of the three maps together, that again, most of the area inside the 10-kilometer zone, certainly all the area in the mixed use zone, all except those two white areas, have been leased out to oil sands companies for oil sands development. And of particular concern to Chief and Council and to the community were those leases that existed entirely within the 10-kilometer zone. So you can see there are two brown circles around leases indicated in brown, and one blue circle indicating a lease in blue that existed entirely within the 10-kilometer zone. What that meant for those developers is that they needed to be able to build their central processing facility on their lease. They could not put it outside the 10-kilometer zone and access the resource underground, as some of these other leased areas, as would have been possible for the developers of some of these other leased areas. And there was a real concern of the community on having central processing facilities, or CPFs for short, inside the 10-kilometer zone, because as the industrial hub of an oil sands development, they're active 24/7. There's all sorts of industrial activity on the site, to and from the site, that could be disruptive to wildlife and to traditional uses. Light, noise, increased potential for accident. It was a real concern for the community that although they were prepared to tolerate underground development with minimal surface disturbance, they really did not want to have central processing facilities inside the 10-kilometer zone. And that becomes even more important beginning on the next slide. So in 2018, through the ordinary regulatory process in play here in Alberta, the Alberta Energy Regulator approved the Prosper Rigel project in June of that year. The Prosper Rigel project was on one of those brown leases on the previous slide. And with the approval, that meant that the project also would include a central processing facility within 3 to 5 kilometers of the Moose Lake reserves. Chief and Council immediately appealed that ruling, which ultimately was heard by the Alberta Court of Appeals on the 30th of October, where it was approved. And then the formal hearing occurred in January of 2020. At the same time that that formal hearing occurred in January 20th, Fort McKay launched an aggressive public relations campaign through both broadcast and social media, because we wanted to bring more than the ordinary pressure on the government to come back to the table to help us to conclude the development of the Moose Lake plan. So there had been 4 attempts to engage with government to develop some sort of a plan, all of which had failed. There was a new government that was elected in the spring of 2019, and we felt that some additional pressure to bring them back would be useful. Formal efforts following an agreement between the Chief Grandjambe and Minister Nixon, who was then the Minister of Environment, happened at a summit in January 31st, 2020. And we began serious work the very next day to develop the Moose Lake plan, which carried on for roughly the next 6 months. Concurrent with that, and I don't think we can underestimate the significance of this, the appeal court returned its decision in April 24th of 2020, and it overturned the Prosper approval, effectively saying that Alberta had failed to deal adequately with the impact of cumulative effects or to maintain the honor of the Crown, because the Moose Lake conversation represented modern treaty implementation. And so the project was overturned, and Alberta was more or less instructed by the Crown, by the court rather, to come back to the table. Next slide. So then again, beginning in February, we spent several months working on developing the Moose, what we call the Moose Lake Policy Exploration, developing the Moose Lake Plan. It's important that we not characterize what happened there as negotiation. One of the comments of our legal counsel, which has become almost an adage or a truism, is that you cannot negotiate treaty rights except to negotiate them away. What we did instead was try to encourage Alberta to share our opinion in the development of new policy, that the Moose Lake area deserved enhanced protection from the government to enable the exercise of treaty rights and traditional land uses. As I say, we spent several months, meeting as many as 8 or 9 times a week through February, March, and April at a table with a large number of stakeholders, all of the oil sands developers and forestry folks, as well as other Indigenous communities who met to explore what this policy might look like if it were to achieve a shared vision. Ultimately, we concluded the conversations in October, and then in February of 2021, Cabinet reached out to Chieftain Council to let them know that the plan had been formally approved earlier that day, which then became formal provincial policy for land use inside the Moose Lake 10-kilometer zone. Next slide. One of the challenges that we had as we were doing this policy exploration work is that industry sort of came to the table and said, look, there's already lots of policy to manage all of this. We think it is sufficient. We don't believe that Moose Lake is anything necessarily special, and we would prefer to proceed as if it were business as usual with what Fort McKay considered to be some very modest concessions. In this map, those blue dots represent an approach that was encouraged by industry for both government and Fort McKay to consider, which is, why don't you figure out, these particular special areas that need special consideration or from which we might want to voluntarily agree not to disturb. And we'll try to work with you on that, but otherwise we think that we ought to be able to proceed within this 10-kilometer zone as if it was the same as any other area in which development or forestry is taking place. And our challenge there, or our disagreement with there fundamentally, is that identifying small discrete elements for special protection within a landscape ignores the Indigenous relationship to the land, and also, frankly, it ignores the requirement for intact and connected habitat. There is no conservation or ecological value to be achieved by little islands of conservation. Next slide. As a group, the folks that sat at that table agreed to adopt a vision for the Moose Lake plan that tried to balance 3 different policy objectives. The first, as I've said several times, was to support the exercise of rights and traditional land uses. Secondly, was to sustain ecological integrity and biodiversity. And the third one was to provide opportunity for responsibly managed resource development that did not compromise either of the first 2. Next slide. Then what we were able to do is to come to an agreement at that stakeholder table that we would approach the problem with an outcome-based planning process so that all of the stakeholders endorsed the vision and the principles. And of course, the text here is much too small for you to see, but I don't know that that matters. If there's anybody in the webinar who'd be interested in hearing more about this, we invite you to contact us directly and we'd be happy to talk about it. I think what was really important was getting all of the stakeholders at the table to agree to the outcomes. Now, the diagram is probably too small for you to see, but the outcomes are really important because once the outcomes are agreed upon, they set a target for performance for Alberta, for Fort McKay, for individual developers, for the industry as a whole, but it's not necessarily prescriptive on how those outcomes might be achieved. So it does provide some flexibility to government and to industry to manage activity within the 10-kilometer zone if they find that there's something innovative that they can do, as long as they are achieving those outcomes. Adaptive management was built into the plan, but I think also key, and this relates back to the previous slide with the blue dots that were islands of conservation, and the position that industry had put forward that existing policy was sufficient. We were able to have Alberta agree that in order for the Moose Lake plan to be successful, it had to adopt a policy plus orientation. So the outcomes were identified for the 10-kilometer zone, and the only way to get there would have been, or is rather, to have policy that's a little more strict than what applies on the immediately adjacent lands. Next slide. Key among those policy innovations that we wanted to highlight because it has relevance here on the conversation about Caribou was the adoption of an interior habitat biodiversity indicator. Basically, that's an assessment of how much of the landscape within the 10-kilometer zone is disturbed by industrial development of all kinds. So that would include even that linear disturbance that was on the map that I showed you several slides ago. And although Alberta has not yet adopted any biodiversity management frameworks for the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan, which is the large-scale regional plan for this area, or any of its others, they did agree to adopt this interior habitat biodiversity indicator to be able to measure the impact of industry within the 10-kilometer zone. Next slide. I think what's particularly important about this instance is that Alberta didn't just look at the disturbance, the industrial disturbance, but it also incorporated for the first time buffers around that disturbance as part of the overall disturbance footprint, recognizing that disturbance has edge effects, that a noisy industrial development will have effects into undisturbed landscape as well. So this was really key, and we were pleased to see Alberta adopt this. Next slide. In practice, as opposed to the policy, you could consider that buffer zones look a little bit like what is indicated on this map, that the black shape in the polygon represents the actual footprint of disturbance, and then the dark blue would represent a 50-meter buffer zone, and the light blue would represent a 200-meter buffer zone. We agreed to a formula here in which those two kinds of buffers were averaged out in order to come up with an average buffer that would acknowledge that something like a well pad, for example, might have larger disturbance than a seismic line, but that something could easily be adopted for the entire internal area. And the flip side of the disturbed area, of course, is the amount of intact habitat, intact interior habitat that is left. Next slide.
You're at about 20 minutes, Mike.
I think I've only got one or two left. I hope I do.
Perfect. Sorry.
Yeah, so we don't need to look at this in any detail, but as part of the Moose Lake Plan that was adopted, the government set targets for maximum amount of disturbance that would be allocated to industry sectors that would help us to manage it in the future. Next slide. And of course, we adopted some outcomes for other aspects as well, in addition to the interior habitat landscape. We adopted measures for air, for water and wetlands, for fish and wildlife management. We're still working on finalizing conditions about access, and we needed to work out some governance since this whole question arose in government to government conversations between Alberta and the First Nation. Next slide. Finally, as I said, the plan was adopted in February of 2021 rather, sorry. As policy, it immediately became effective for the regulators and others who were working with industry, but two other additional comments that are important. The first was $8 million contributed by Alberta to enable the restoration of legacy seismic lines inside the 10-kilometer zone, which overlap with the Red Earth Caribou Range. So that's the direct link to this conversation today. The second is annual funding, and I realized this morning that I made a mistake there. It's not $150,000, it's $75,000 annually that will support our Environmental Guardians program, with an additional $125,000 a year to support air monitoring. Next slide. And lastly, there was, as I said, as soon as the policy or the Moose Lake Plan was adopted, it became policy that would guide the decisions of regulators And that's what this slide relates to in terms of oil and gas tenure within the 10-kilometer zone. And it is all now subject to the Moose Lake Plan. Thank you very much. We'll hand this off now to Lorne to talk specifically about caribou restoration.
Thank you, Mike, and hello to everybody across Canada. It's good to at least see your names represented. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, the planning for the restoration. That was the $8 million that was contributed by the Alberta government. Anyway, so a little bit of background on the red earth caribou range and its herd. There's an estimated 390 caribou in the range. Latest numbers that have come out of Alberta Environment and Protected Areas. The important part about that is this is a caribou herd that is in trouble. The population is in decline, and it's been modeled as not a self-sustaining herd. So if things stay the way they are, it's quite likely the herd will go to a local extinction event. And the range is quite large. It's the red earth caribou range is about 25,000 square kilometers, but it's highly disturbed. ECCC estimates are 72% of that area is disturbed and not viable caribou habitat. And a big contributor to that is human-caused damage. 40% of that is because of us. And a big contributor to that is 43,000 kilometers of legacy seismic lines. Another major problem is wildfire. And this is just indicates that work needs to be done. So next slide, please. So as previously discussed, Alberta government has contributed $8 million for restoration in the range. And this money is being managed by the Forest Resource Improvement Association of Alberta. And a couple of years ago, they issued an RFP, a request for proposal to plan the restoration that would occur in this area. WSP, formerly known as Gould Associates, partnered with the Fort McKay First Nation, as well as LPAC, and put in a proposal for the restoration planning, and were successful. WSP was very proactive. The RFP required an incorporation of Indigenous knowledge. They decided to partner with Fort McKay. And this plan is going to provide that ongoing approach to how this land is going to be restored in the red earth caribou range. Next slide, please. So within the Moose Lake area, and then this is the 10-kilometer zone that Mike described earlier. This is the treatments, and this is going to have a net benefit to caribou habitat and caribou recovery in the Moose Lake area of an estimated, based on the buffer zone system that Alberta Environment and Parks and Protected Area decided would be effective and or would be acknowledged in this area. It would add another 28.4 square kilometers of interior habitat that would be helpful for caribou recovery as well as other wildlife, and of course the continued land use by the Fort McKay community. It represents 2.7% of the 10-kilometer zone, or what I will call the Moose Lake area. The part of the slide inside is sort of a graphic representation of seismic lines being reclaimed, and hopefully that more natural area being created. Next slide, please. So the proposal involved the Fort McKay, and Fort McKay is a true partner in this, and they've been able to provide throughout the planning process ongoing support, direction for where restoration is going to occur. There's been a lot of community meetings that have been facilitated by the WSP team, who are facilitating all of the engagement. Also, another very important part is making this project work well is the fact that WSP reached out to Fort McKay and they developed a very strong data sharing agreement so that in fact any Indigenous knowledge shared by the Fort McKay community is used appropriately and that the community actually maintains ownership of their information and it's used in methods that are agreeable to the nation. What we want to just say is this has been a very positive collaboration. And we want to actually reach out and we have to acknowledge that Paula Bentham, a principal at WSP, formerly Goulder, was they acknowledged and recognized very early when the RFP was initiated that Fort McKay had to be involved. They knew about and they recognized the Moose Lake area and made sure that this collaboration has worked. So, I mean, really need to send out a kudos to Goulder at the time and now WSP, and as well as LPAC's been very, very cooperative with providing information to make this project much better. Next slide, please. So, as I said, I mean, the main primary goal of this project was to discuss with the community about the seismic lines and how restoration would occur in an appropriate way. And this was done through a series of online community meetings where the WSP team brought members of the Fort McKay community to the table. They brought in land users, knowledge holders, trappers, cabin owners that are active on the land and were able to have a dialogue about which of these seismic lines were important for transportation and access to the area. It was very important, and one of the primary goals of this was to identify those key trails that allowed rights activities, traditional land use, and access to the land. It was also a really good opportunity for WSP to discuss what the restoration would look like so they could hear the concerns from the community about how heavy equipment might affect the wildlife, traditional practices, and also disturb fish-bearing streams that could affect the water quality of both Buffalo and Moose Lakes. It was also a great exchange to discuss with communities about what they knew about the caribou in the area, so that in fact that this project would not have a detrimental effect on the existing caribou populations and allowed for planning around timing of restoration to avoid maybe sensitive times of the year when caribou would be most vulnerable. Next slide, please.
Got about 3 minutes left, Lorne.
Okay, great. So what did we find? I mean, the whole thing was about an engagement with the community and the consultants and the government to try and prioritize and plan the restoration moving forward so that there was, in fact, it was done in an appropriate manner that provided an opportunity to bring back caribou habitat, but also not have a detrimental effect on traditional land uses. So this slide represents the findings. So the seismic lines were categorized into 3 main categories. It's a little tricky to see, but there's 3 different colors. There's a dark green, light green, and red green. Squint at the screen or whatever you need to do. But so the 3 categories. So one of the findings was there's a dark green. So this is the area that was determined to require an active restoration component. That means these are the areas where the heavy equipment would have to go, there would be mounding of the ground, and there would be tree planting and active restoration activities because the land was highly disturbed and it just wasn't coming back on its own. The light green areas are the areas that aren't going to be actively restored because the WSP team, along with community members, went out, looked at the land, and it was determined that the natural vegetation regrowth and regeneration was actually coming back on a trajectory that would be effective habitat and would contribute back to that interior habitat that's required for wildlife and caribou. And it didn't need active. So these areas were going to be left alone to just naturally reoccur and come back as habitat. The Then the red months, this was the, one of the really important parts of the community engagement and whatnot. This was where we sat down and there was trappers and land users and knowledge holders sat down with WSP and said, no, let's not, we can't, please don't restore those habitats or those seismic lines, because that's where I take my quad to get my trap line. That's how I get to my favorite fishing spot. That's how I get to my cabin, or how Fort McKay community gets to Moose Lake and Buffalo Lake. And then this is actually the results of what we've done. And this is going to lead to the next step of where they actually get out on the land and start planting trees and hopefully recovering caribou habitat and other wildlife habitat. And I just want to qualify, this is not set in stone. There's ongoing dialogue and it's subject to change. And I'm now going to pass it on to Ryan, who's going to talk to you about the Environmental Guardian Program. And thank you.
Hello and welcome everybody. I hope everybody can hear me well. I'm coming to you from the traditional territory of Fort McKay First Nation. We are Cree, Dene, and Métis descent, and just want to talk a little bit about the Guardian program. The Moose Lake plan includes capacity funding from Fort McKay's existing Guardian program, and we also got funding from the ECCC that supported the program for the last 4 years. The Guardian program monitors ecological integrity of the 10K zone, including water quality, quantity parameters in Moose Lake and in Buffalo Lake. The Guardian program has deployed cameras and autonomous recording units across the 10K zone to record the presence of wildlife, including Boreal caribou, caribou predators, and alternate prey. Monitoring data is shared within the community on a community-based frame. Next slide, please. The Guardian program, we have 70 locations so far since the early 2019. Cameras are located within a 10K zone, Red Earth Caribou Range, and elsewhere within the Fort McKay's traditional territory. And here's just a little map of the spread of our camera. The 10K zone is in the bulk of all the cameras on the left and the center side. And the right side was actually some cameras we put in on one of the local trappers' trap line. Next slide, please. I just want to share a little bit of the photos we've captured throughout our little program. And this here is a lovely caribou. In Cree, we say a teak. And so far, we've recorded 5 caribous at 4 different locations. And it's basically we've been recording 1 a year. So we've been fortunate in that. We'd like to see more, but next slide. And here's another caribou. So that caribou we just seen in the last slide and this slide was within the first 6 months of our program. This young caribou was the first we've seen in our program, and he was caught 3 months within the start of our program. And they were 24 kilometers apart as the crow flies. Next slide, please. And here's again is an older female caribou. I've come to learn in this program that caribou, both the female and males have antlers. So I was surprised to learn that, and identifying them is simply by the heart shape on their behind. Next slide, please, as we know. And then I just like to introduce some of the predators we've identified throughout our territory. And this is our lovely wolf, and we pronounce it in our language Cree is Maikan. And again, these are just 2 different locations of black wolves, and we've noticed there's quite a few black wolves within the territory. Next slide. And we've also recorded a large pack of 9. And again, some more predators. Here we got Muskwa, and that's a bear, and for his little baby there, it's Muskwasis. And then again, too, throughout the program, every camera that we've placed out there, we've got at least one visit from a bear to come and sniff out the cameras. And like I've said to the community, I don't know if it's because of the camera, if they like the smell of the plastic, or they like the smell of the onion. Thank you. Next slide. And some more of the predators that we've noticed throughout our territory, and basically about 70% of the cameras that we've picked up, at least one wolverine. And again, in Cree, we pronounce that Hikwakyu, and that's just a lovely wolverine there. And this guy, as you can see, he's been hanging out for a little while at this camera here. He's got, if you squint real closely, you can see the damage on his ear. Next slide. And another one here we don't see too many of, but this is just a little coyote. And then again in Cree, we pronounce that Mista Jagans. Maybe we've seen recorded four different camera sites, and they were always by themselves. So lonely coyotes hanging out there. Next slide. Alternate prey, we have the deer, Epsimus. White-tailed deer have been recorded in the Moose Lake area. Deer numbers appears to increase within the last 5 years. So for historically growing up here, we haven't noticed a lot of deer, but now with the program, since we've developed the program, we've noticed the deer numbers do increase, and population is getting better for the deer. The numbers are growing because there's instead of seeing one deer, there's usually 2 or 3 bouncing around within the camera. Next slide. And some more alternate prey. Here we got a moose, mooswa, and moose are cultural keystone species to the community. For us, again, growing up here in the community, that's been our main source of protein was the moose. But within the community engagement, there's stories of the caribou swimming across the Athabasca looking like sticks. So at one point there wasn't an abundance of caribou here, and it was part of our diet, but in the last 50 years, that number has drastically declined, and caribou are very seldom to be seen around our territory now. Next slide. Thank you. Talk to me again. Thank you very much, everybody. And here we'll open up for some questions, and I'll pass it back. Thank you very much.
Glesh, thank you so much, Ryan, for that presentation. And thank you, Lorne and Mike, for your presentations as well. Very interesting stuff. And I'm wondering, I'm sure those of you who are on the line have some questions for our presenters. I would invite you to post them in the chat. Matt Bachner, I see you're here on the line. I'm wondering if you have any questions for our presenters here today, and just maybe introduce yourself as you come on.
Hi, just checking my mic. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. Hi, thanks, Amanda, and thanks for the amazing presentation, Lauren, Ryan, and Mike. That was excellent. So I'm Matthew Beckner, and I'm the lead coordinator for the National Boreal Caribou Knowledge Consortium, of which many of you are members. It's good to see so many faces today. But I have a question, I guess primarily for Lauren. I'm just really curious, like this is so interesting to see, first of all, how you came about identifying the areas for restoration. I'm curious to know, going forward, are you going to monitor the red lines, the light green lines, and the dark green lines, and measure how much the caribou are changing their use around those areas because there's different treatments? And then finally, how long are you going to do that? What's the timeline for this?
Very good questions, Matt. So we do have multiple cameras out along the lines. I mean, a lot of our cameras are already sort of opportunistically played online. So we have an opportunity to sort of look at changes as wildlife movement. And we haven't done this yet, but we have the opportunity to even use the cameras to sort of monitor the regeneration that might occur. From a time frame, we haven't really discussed that. What we do have on the land out there is we are also sharing space with the Canadian Forest Service, who are also doing monitoring out there and are very interested in activity on the restoration line. So I guess what I'm saying is there's not really concrete plans for monitoring restoration success or changes, but we do have the tools in place, and I think we are going to work on ways of answering some of those questions.
Great, thanks very much, Lauren. We've got a few questions in the chat. So from Craig, we have the move to do the plan predated the Yahi decision. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. Is there anything about that decision that influences how things have been done going forward? We also have another question from Mike D'Entremont. How many Guardians are working on the program? Have there been any challenges in implementing the program, and how have these been addressed? I'm just going to read out all of them and give everyone a chance, each of our speakers a chance to respond to them. This one from Michael Cody: given the portion of lines that the community will choose to leave open, what percentage of caribou range within the area can ultimately become intact? And finally from Skylar, great presentation. I'm wondering about how you anticipate industry meeting the 85% intact landscape, especially given how long reclamation restoration takes and how fast industry likes to move through applications. So some big questions, and about 5 or 6 minutes. I welcome first, maybe we can go Ryan, Lauren, and then Mike. So if you can each take a minute or two just to answer what you can from those big questions. So Ryan, did you want to take a stab at that? How many Guardians are working on the program, and have there been any challenges?
So there's just myself currently working in the program. Challenges have been getting some bodies to help out, but how we actually curb those challenges is working alongside the park ranger program and using the park rangers whenever necessary, working with their schedule, because they're actually trying to implement the program as they're going as well. So yeah, that's been the most difficult part, I guess, but everything else, we've got a good team here at the sustainability office. We got good resources, and it's been really a great program.
Wonderful, thank you, Ryan. And Lauren, do you want to take a crack at any of these questions?
I think it was Michael Cody's question about I think he was referring to intact caribou habitat or critical habitat. And I think that's at this point in time, I would say it's pretty hard to answer. I mean, one of the interesting things is there's a different criteria for habitat intactness or that. So I think at this point in time, we really can't comment on about the increase in critical caribou habitat, because we haven't really done the analysis based on the 500-meter buffers that's been used by ECCC when they're defining critical habitat and how intact it is. So I guess it's really a non-answer, but I think it's a really good question.
Thanks, Lauren, and over to you, Mike, for some wrap-up comments.
Yeah. There are two, and if I could, I'd like to address them in reverse order. So Skylar had asked initially about the 85% intact landscape target inside the Moose Lake 10-kilometer zone. Presently, that landscape is 86.5% intact. So there's 1.5% of the area within the park, or within the 10-kilometer zone rather, that is quote unquote available for industrial disturbance. I think it's important to note that nearly half of the 10-kilometer zone is inside the Birch Mountains Wildland Provincial Park I'd mentioned earlier, within which development is prohibited. So the allowable disturbance for industrial development is to be accommodated entirely by that mixed use zone, which was on the southeast side. What that really means is that in order for any industrial development to take place within the park, restoration has to happen before development can proceed. So that's part of the program that we're working on with the Caribou Range restoration. And it's also why we didn't want to have CPFs be part of the program, because they disturbed a much larger footprint. And there is possibility to deal with well pads that are at some distance from that single central plant. So right now we're actually meeting the target, but any future development would have to comply. and developers would have to do progressive reclamation themselves on their projects as they're working through. The other question from Craig relating to the Yehi decision. Certainly from the First Nations perspective, and I would think that this is true across Canada, all First Nations think that the Yehi decision has implications for their engagement with provincial governments on resource development issues. However, because that was a decision delivered by the BC Supreme Court and the government in BC did not challenge that decision, it did not proceed to the Supreme Court of Canada. And so the law that is inscribed in that decision technically applies only in BC right now. It is possible that it could become applicable from coast to coast to coast if someone were to challenge something similarly in a different jurisdiction, and that case could be cited as precedent. But right now, in sort of practical terms, there's nothing in Yehi that would affect what we're doing at Moose Lake. That said, the Yehi decision obviously is hugely important, because what the court found in that instance is that the BC government had failed to protect treaty rights. It had allowed enough development to occur that there was demonstrable infringement on those treaty rights that had occurred as a result. And they put a moratorium on any development that wasn't subsequently approved by the nation.
That's great. Well, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Lorne, and thank you, Ryan, for taking the time to explain this agreement to us and how you're working to implement it. There was clearly a lot of interest. We had upwards of 100 people at any moment. I noticed some people are dropping off now because it is the top of the hour. So I'd like to just formally close this portion of our event with a huge thank you to our presenters.